Hello, everyone. My name is Weston Kunishi. I'm president of the Sake Brewers Association of North America. I'd like to welcome you all to this evening's webinar. We are super excited to have with us tonight Professor Eric Rath of the University of Kansas, who has recently published an article in Gastronomica called Sake Journal Goshu no Nikki, Japan's oldest guide to brewing. A lot of folks in our communities, when they saw this article come up, sent it my way. And so I know there's a lot of interest in the sake brewing community and with our membership with this piece. And so we're just delighted to have Professor Rath with us tonight. He is a teacher in modern Japanese history and Japanese dietary cultures, including history of sushi and beer, sake, and tea beverages in Japanese history at the University of Kansas. Tonight's session will be recorded, so if you want to refer to it again in the future, by all means, check it out on our website or on our YouTube channel. What else? We will have a Q&A session, and Professor Rath has agreed to answer the questions at the end of his presentation. He'll provide a PowerPoint presentation for the first part of our session, and then we'll segue into the Q&A session. Feel free, though, to post your questions throughout his talk using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens. And then we'll get to those questions and hopefully answer as many of them as we can. We'll wrap up basically in an hour, but if we want to go a little bit longer, we will. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Professor Rath. And I will share my screen.
And I hope I'm sharing mine. Can everyone see that?
I can see it. Our viewers can.
Okay. Thank you so much, Weston, for inviting me to talk, and it's a great honor to speak with the Sake Brewers Association of North America. Actually, I'm really thrilled to meet all of you virtually because I'm writing this history of sake, and I seem to be stuck in the early modern period right now, but eventually I'll get to the modern period, and so there's many of you that I want to speak with someday when modern period talk about sake's globalization. But for today, I wanted to talk about sake's medieval traditions, and specifically this fascinating text that is Japan's first guide to brewing sake. To give you a rundown of what I wanted to talk about, Weston asked me to say a little bit about who I am. I'm obviously not a brewer like yourselves, but I can share my background with you. And then I want to delve into the world of these texts and answer the question, what records do we have to know about the brewing process in the pre-modern period, in the period before 1868? So what records do we have? Then I want to talk about medieval brewing technology and how sake was made, and then the varieties of sake that were made. And when I first got into this study, I would often see sake in a text, and it was only later that I realized, wow, there's such a great variety to sake in the medieval period. Then look at this text more closely, this medieval guide to brewing, the Sake Journal, and specifically some of the recipes, and then we'll have time for questions at the end. I do encourage you, if you like, to put the questions into chat that you might have, but I won't be able to look at those while I'm giving my talk, so I can look at those at the end or ask Weston to help me with your questions. So let's get started. I'm a little embarrassed to put up this thing, but it's about who I am. I've been researching Japanese food culture for the last 22 years or so, and have a number of books. And I guess I would say sake has been part of that. it's kind of always been there. And also it's been also absent, because if we focus on food, oftentimes sake is mentioned, but it's not really mentioned in much detail. So for example, if we want to know what good pairings were for sake in the medieval early modern period, were sunk, because people didn't talk about that. People didn't really have much to say about the taste of food in general in early modern and medieval writings. So it's a little bit frustrating, but nonetheless, sake is important to Japanese food culture. And finally, I'm getting around to writing this history of sake that I've wanted to do for so long. As a sort of baby step toward that, that was that translation project that I'll talk about today. And I'm also writing a few articles for the Sake Times and Sake Today, which I'm enjoying doing. So moving on, what are these pre-modern texts that we know about sake? How can we reconstruct sake? It's a challenge, to say the least. The earliest are these wood slats called mokan. And mokan, excuse me, I'd like to compare them to baggage tags. So if you go to the airport and you check your luggage, right, and they print out these long strips of paper and they put it on the handle of your suitcase, that's what mokan were. They're strips indicating items and where they're to be sent. So they don't provide a lot of information, but nonetheless, there's quite a few of them about sake that say some information about sake, and these have been unearthed from the 8th century. According to some scholars and to some brewers, and I'll say more about that in a moment, there is enough to reconstruct 8th century sake recipes. I personally am a little bit skeptical about that, but I haven't really looked at the particular mokan that they've studied and have used. Yeah, I'm rather skeptical about that. The other important text for ancient period is the procedures of the Engi era. Now, this text is about ceremonies and rituals, and it says a little bit about how sake was made, but just gives some ingredients. So in other words, it doesn't provide any recipes for us. So using that text, we can know the names for different types of sake. And there's about a dozen of them that appear in the procedures of the Engi era. But how they were made, that's a real challenge. It's not until we get into the medieval period and we can see a text like Sake Journal, Goshu no Nikki, that we get a sense more for how these ingredients are supposed to be put together. Now, the frustrating thing is there's more we want to know, because there's so much that these recipes do not tell us. And that seems to be a general rule of thumb for recipes written in the medieval period and the early modern period, whether they be for food or for sake. They leave so much out, you know. But nonetheless, they do provide some inspirations and some ideas and give us a sense for how brewers worked. That's an important text. The other key text for the medieval period is a journal that was held at a temple, or it was created at a temple in Nara called Tamonin. And that particular temple kept a record of things that they made. So they made their own miso and they made their own sake. And in that record, we can find references, for example, to pasteurization and to other important things. So it's a very important record for us. I didn't just mute myself, did I? No? Okay, good. Whoops. Let me go back here. Early modern period, the first major text, and probably the most important one to brewing, is called The Idiot's Guide to Sake Brewing. I know that sounds like a modern title, but it's actually early modern work, and it's probably one of the most detailed early modern works about brewing. Maybe I can talk about that another time with you. One thing that these texts, the Sake Journal, Tamonin Nikki, the Tamonin Journal, and the Idiot's Guide all have in common is that they're secret. So in other words, they weren't widely read. These are something that a master, the equivalent of a toji, would record and give just to his select or her select, if it's the medieval period, their select disciples. So this is very confidential information. And that's what the medieval world was all about, was secret knowledge. So these are secret writings. They're not widely known. And indeed, they all refer to themselves as being secret, and they urge the reader to keep the knowledge secret. But of course, now anybody can read these things. Some of these writings do provide inspiration for modern day brewers. And so going back to that question about the Mokkan, there's a brewery in Nara, which allegedly recreated sake from Mokkan. These particular sake, if I can go back to the previous slide, were from a trove at the residence of Prince Nagaya, very important political figure of the 7th and early 8th century. And a trove of these Mokkan were discovered as residents. And apparently there was enough information, at least for Yamatsuru Brewery, to go through these and to find some inspiration for making, recreating 8th century sake. I've also heard of other people trying to do this too. I have a colleague in Japan who's working with a different brewery trying to bring back 8th century sake. For me as a historian, this is fascinating stuff. How does it taste? I hope to find out someday. Let's talk a little bit about new brewing technology, because that's going to really help us understand the world that this text was created in, the Goshu Nikki, the sake journal. First of all, in the medieval period, 1200 to 1600, there are two types of breweries. There are mom and pop shops, is what I like to call them. And in Kyoto, in the early 15th century, there are about 347 of them, these small breweries. Now, their competitors, if you will, are temple brewers, folks like Tammonin or other prominent temples who are brewing their own sake. They're brewing it for the monks, even though the monks have sake, mind you. Temples and shrines, basically the same thing in this period. And the kami-sama, the Shinto deities, they need sake to drink. So of course they're making it for them, but of course the monks tipple as well, they drink as well. So they make sake for their own consumption and for commercial consumption. And they're the competitors, you might say, with the mom and pop shops, numbering several hundred in Kyoto. How does brewing work? Well, based on what I've understood from this sake journal, the brewers will start their ferment in a bucket and then transfer it to a larger jar, a tsubo or a kame. Now, tsubo are jars with a narrow neck, and kame have a wider neck. And these jars are ceramic. And there's a technical limitation on how large you can make these jars, because they just become simply unwieldy. In fact, a typical jar would have to be sunk in the earth anyways. They dig a hole and put it in. So a typical brewery, in other words, would have a number, perhaps dozens, or even maybe several hundreds of these one koku jars. Maybe a couple would have 2 or 3 koku jars, but most of them would be one koku jars, which means, koku being 45 gallons, that's by more modern standards, kind of small batch brewing. These jars don't have lids. They use mats for lids. And it's my supposition, because they're relying on ambient yeasts, that these matted lids help capture the yeasts that are floating around. And perhaps that's why the brewers use them year after year, as opposed to using a ceramic lid for the containers. If you're a medieval brewer, one thing you would not be doing is making your own koji. You'd have to buy your koji. Why? Because there's a koji monopoly in Kyoto. It's affiliated with a very powerful shrine Kitano Tenjin's shrine. And the shogun's law stated that if you were brewing sake, you had to buy directly from the Koji guild. As a sort of side note, here's a Koji seller. It's a woman who's selling the Koji. She has Koji in those trays out there. Probably it's Koji that's been already inoculating rice. So in other words, it's not the tani Koji, it's not the dry powder, which was also produced, but rather a Koji in the rice. So you could take this, you could use it for miso making, you could use it for soy sauce making, but above all, it seems by the caption that it's meant for sake making, because she says, hey, sake lovers, take a look at my Koji, but don't drool on it. I love that caption. So if you're a brewer, you have to buy your Koji. What happens if you want to make your own Koji in this period? You run the risk of the shogun sending his samurai tearing down your brewery. So it's serious stuff. People got in fights and had battles about this matter. So you purchase your own Koji. And what kind of sake are you making? Well, this is sake before the advent of seishu. So before the early modern period, when really the recipe for sake gets set. What does that mean? That means some of the recipes would be for the equivalent of brown rice or polished rice. And the amount of polishing would be very minimal by modern standards. In fact, the rice would probably still look a little bit brown, because back in the medieval period, the way they polished is basically getting a wooden mortar and having a wood pestle and pounding the rice. So it's very labor intensive. It's not that effective polishing. If you really go at it, you run the risk of shattering the rice. So it's very minimally polished. At what level? I mean, who can say? It's hard to know, but it's much less polished than, say, modern table rice. Yeasts, people haven't isolated yeast set yet, so they're relying upon ambient yeasts and probably not understanding, the whole idea of yeasts. But at least I haven't read anything where medieval people talk about yeasts so much. It could be out there, I just haven't encountered it yet. Most of the recipes that I'll talk about today are for one edition of extra rice. So in other words, you're making an initial starter with rice and Koji and water, and then later on adding some more Koji and some rice. Now, in the early modern period, it became standard, as all of you know, to do this. So you have sandan zukuri. Well, the medieval recipes are mostly ichidan, so one edition of rice and Koji. Now, some temples like Tamonin, where they're able to do things a little more sophisticatedly, they would add 2 extra batches, sometimes 3. And we have that. That's something else we can know from the Tamonin records. We know the sake is pressed. That's pretty easy to do. You just put it in a bag and squeeze, right? It was pasteurized, and probably several times too. That's what the records seem to indicate to me, at least, and that makes sense, but it wasn't, there was no agents in there to clarify the sake. So it was still kind of had a yellowish look to it. I don't get any references in medieval texts to adding charcoal or something like that to clarify the sake, to make it clear. Because I haven't seen those yet. So I've been talking about sake, and here's the sake seller from the same picture scroll. And I should say something about that picture scroll. It's one that dates from 1500. It's poetry contests, should be contests, not contexts. Context, poetry contests by various artisans. And it shows 142 artisans with a little bit of verse by them. And here we have the sake seller, who happens, like the Koji seller before her, to be a woman. Sake. There's so many different types of sake in the medieval period. You have some that are named after temples. You have some that are made at certain seasons, because brewing is year-round. For imperial ceremonies, specifically for the emperor's enthronement rites, you have white sake, which is a nigori sake, or that's what we would call it today. And then you have black sake. You have sake that's darkened with ash from this flower, the glory bower. And that would help to cut the acidity. Then you have people talking about different types of cloudy sake and clarified sake. So in the image here, our sake seller is saying to us in a caption, hey, try my sake, and I have usu nigori. I have this clarified sake. I have sake that's began as nigori, but I allowed it to settle, and all the leaves went to the bottom, and it's a little bit clearer than a cloudy nigori sake. And indeed, we can look inside her barrel, and we can see, oh yeah, it's not white, it's yellow. But I think she's got the good stuff behind her, because if you see these jars she's got back there, nicely decorated stuff, that's probably where she's got her good sake, whatever that is. Is it one of the recipes that I'll talk about from Goshu and Nikki? Perhaps, but it might be an aged sake, because one of the virtues of using these ceramic containers was that you could keep sake for a long time, unlike the wooden barrels that people used in the early modern period. It became much more of a challenge to age sake. And in the medieval period, we know that the shogun and other folks like that, they loved aged sake. Aging sake for 2-3 years, sometimes 10 years. So maybe that's what she's got in those attractive containers back there, some aged sake. So all different kinds of sake. And some people might even dispute these are actually sake, because they're not sake like the sake that we know today. If I could share something with you, and I know it won't go any further. When I wrote my article and sent it in to Gastronomica, one of the reviewers said, we shouldn't call these sake. These are not sake. These are alcoholic beverages made from rice. So he or she said something like that. And I thought, well, yes, it's true they're not like modern sake, but sure enough, the text called them sake. So I think back in the medieval period, when people said sake, they were open to all different kinds of varieties, much more perhaps than some people are today. Here's a picture, kind of a gratuitous one, because this is my own homemade sake, and I'm probably insulting your intelligence by demonstrating what usu nigori is. It's a nigori where it's been clarified a little bit. And in the early modern period, this was sold for a higher price, and they called it nakagumi. So, sake journal now, Goshu no Nikki. It's a very short text. It has approximately 6 recipes, and it has some directions for how to pasteurize sake. And I'm not afraid of calling that pasteurization, because people in the text, people in the time, they knew that if you raised the temperature of sake, it had a longer shelf life. So that's basically pasteurization. 6 recipes for pasteurization. And then at the end, we get these very odd notes that scholars don't know what to make of. Most of them, when they talk about this text, they just ignore that stuff. But some people, they think, well, maybe there's some directions to make some vinegar here. I don't know. I didn't translate that stuff because I couldn't figure it out either. But it is at the end of this text. Delving in now to the recipes themselves. We have 6 recipes, and the text takes its name from the first recipe. The text is in fact not sake diary or sake journal, but Goshu no Nikki. Goshu was a very famous type of sake that's mentioned back in that 10th century Engishiki text that I mentioned earlier. Goshu was a sake that was made for the imperial court, specifically for the emperor, for his daily use, or for special occasions. It had a lot of koji, 60% according to the recipe from the medieval period. And the medieval recipe shows a different way it was made than it was made back in the ancient period. In the ancient period, when people were making this type of recipe for Goshu, they would make sake, they would press it, and that was called shiori. That's where the method came from. And then they would make more sake and add those extra ingredients to that previously made sake. So they would make sake, add more ingredients to the sake, make sake, press it, have a kind of finished product, and then keep doing that several times, adding more ingredients to finish sake. That's called the shiori method. That was the ancient method for doing this. That was the way they boosted the alcohol content. No wonder the emperor liked it, right? But in this period, they don't do that. In the medieval period, they've gone away from that. They have a simpler method. They create a starter, and then they add one set more ingredients. So that's where this text takes its name from. I think this text is a recipe collection of famous varieties of sake. Somebody sat down and said, what are the sake they're going to sell in the medieval period? And they listed Goshu because of its association with the imperial court. And then they picked the two most prominent temple sake, Amano and Bodaisen. Both of them were references to temples in the Kansai region. Temples that produced sake. Amano produced sake, and Shorakuji Temple, which was near this river called Bodaisen, produced sake. And they were famous temple sake brewers. And so these apparently are their recipes. And they're recorded in this text. Now, Amano sake is a winter sake, brewed with brown rice. Bodaisen is a summer sake, brewed with polished rice. So you get the sense, yeah, people are brewing sake year round. Why not? Our fourth recipe is one for a sake called Hikaki. And what this is, we really don't know. I included the recipe in my translation, but it puzzles many sake scholars, and it puzzles me. I just put it there because just to give people kind of raw information. Maybe one of you brewers can kind of figure out what's going on there. I'll leave that to you. The fifth sake also must have been a prestige sake because it's given a very fancy name. And that fancy name is glossy silk. It's by any other name, it would be a cloudy sake. But this sake apparently has a little bit of prestige to it. And I'll talk more about that glossy silk in just a moment. But apparently, I mean, that's the kind of the brand name, the style name that's given us is glossy silk. It relies upon a Bodai Moto method, and that was true of Bodaisen and true of the other ones. Now, and I'll say something about that. You're probably familiar with the Bodai Moto method. It uses polished rice. It's a spring sake. The directions say don't make it until after the New Year's. That would be the lunar New Year's. That would be February. So it's one that you're supposed to make in February. There's a final recipe too that we can't make heads or tails of. It's for chrysanthemum sake. Now, most of the time when people talk about chrysanthemum sake, it's just simply putting a chrysanthemum flower in sake. That's what people do. It's a tonic. You see, there's a Chinese story about how people who drank chrysanthemums would live for. The Japanese like that idea, so that on special holidays they would drink chrysanthemums and sake. This recipe seems to suggest, and it's fragmentary, so we really don't know, seems to suggest that you're supposed to put chrysanthemums in, I mean, actual chrysanthemums in the brew. Is this some sort of like Hanamoto method? Is it supposed to use some sort of herb starter? Maybe, I don't know. And the other sake scholars whose writings I referred to, they don't know either. So I didn't include it in my translation. Before moving any further, I wanted to mention yet another picture scroll. This is a wild, this scroll shows a wild medieval sake party. It's from a scroll called the Tea and Rice Debate. And it's a beautiful, if you ever have a chance to take a look at this, it's a wonderful early 16th century picture scroll where a monk who's very fond of rice gets into an argument with a colleague, a layperson who's very fond of sake. And there's all these wonderful scenes of banqueting and drinking. And oh my gosh, in this scene, you can see people have really had a lot to drink because they've taken their shirts off and they're getting really wild. You notice that one of the guy with the white garment, he's even got a huge sake cup that he's drinking from. And then there's a youth in front of him with a sake pourer, sake warmer that's ready to give him more. Actually, wild event. So to look now at a couple of these recipes, I wanted to look at bodaisen, and this is used as the Bodaimoto method, and you're probably all familiar with that, but maybe there's some folks who aren't, so I'll say something about that. Nowadays, I'm sure all of you brewers, unless you're real old school, will add a dose of lactic acid when you brew sake, because that makes a nice environment for brewing, for starting your sake yeast. It's something that a home brewer would do as well, just a little bit. But before people added, chemical lactic acid, they did the same thing. They produced lactic acid themselves by soaking rice in water for several days. The rice and the water, the water breaks down the rice, it produces lactic acid. And lactic acid, this is something that's really known to Japanese because it's very important for sushi making. The earliest types of sushi were through this lactic acid fermentation, where lactic acid in a grain, the fish, basically fish is salted, it's put in a container with rice, it's left, and then over time, the rice breaks down into lactic acid that changes the pH of the fish. It helps preserve it. Also will eventually break down the fish into all sorts of tasty amino acids so that you can even, it softens the bones, you can even eat them. So Japanese knew about how to produce their own lactic acid. They knew it was great for fermentation because it would prevent stray microbes from going in there and ruining it. And so they did this, and the directions in Sake Journal tells us how they did it. They would cook some rice and put it in a wicker basket, and they would submerge it in raw, uncooked rice for several days. Then they would draw off the liquid, and they would use both the rice and the liquid for brewing. So they made their own lactic acid. Now, you might be familiar that a similar technique is used to make a Bodaimoto starter at Shodakuji Temple in Nara. I think every January, local brewers in Nara, they gather at Shodakuji, and they do something very similar. The one thing that they do different from the medieval recipe is that they use cooked rice for both of the stages. They submerge the cooked rice in cooked rice, and they leave it for a while. And then they prepare both that way for their starter. But the medieval recipe departs because it suggests using raw rice. Bodaimoto was supposed to be kind of more umami rich in terms of its flavor profile. Probably that was true for the medieval Bodai-sen. And the Bodai-sen comes from, as I said, that river that flows near Shodakuji Temple in Nara. So that's a recipe that caught my eye in the Goshu no Nikki and Sake Journal, because it's become more prominent in Japan today with the revival of the Bodai-moto method at Shodakuji. Another recipe that caught my eye that I mentioned earlier was this neri nuki, or neri sake. And this is a real fancy name. Just in the same way that the compiler of Sake Journal accredited some of the recipes to famous temples that produce sake, they also use this name. And what is this? Well, neri nuki, or neri sake, neri nuki refers to a type of kimono fabric. This may not be the best example on the slide, but maybe you've seen those samurai movies where usually it's a female aristocrat. She's got this kind of gauzy silk that she hangs around her hats. I have this image in my head from one of these samurai films of this samurai or aristocrat wearing this kind of gauzy kind of silk fabric. That was neri nuki. And that was a very expensive fabric. That was something that very high-ranking warlords would use to make coats such as this kosode back in the 15th, 16th century. So no wonder somebody wanted to name a sake after it. There is a modern version of this neri sake, and that is made in Fukuoka by this brewery called Wakatate Yashuzo. And it's a little bit different from the medieval recipe, because the medieval recipe, it's made entirely of non-glutinous rice. But the neri sake that's produced in Fukuoka today is made with this glutinous rice. And it's a nigori sake, as you can see, and it's almost got the consistency of yogurt. If you were to pour it, it's like really glug, 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 kind of like a yogurt drink, and very low alcohol. But another reason why I want to talk about neri nuki neri sake is that it helped to differentiate there's so many different types of nigori sake out there, because probably most of the sake had some cloudiness to it back in the medieval period. But calling a specific type of cloudy sake neri nuki, I think that really gave it more brand value in the medieval marketplace, because it had very nice influential associations with it. I've talked quite a little bit. I'm on almost 40 minutes here, and I think maybe this is a good point for me to ask if you had a little bit too much like these drinkers at this medieval sake party in Shuhanran Emaki. One question I'm not going to answer is about what the dog's going to do in this picture, but I'm willing to entertain other ones. And so if Wes wants to jump in and facilitate that conversation, that would be just great.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Rath. That was so insightful and interesting. A great overview of your work and and what the Sake Journal is all about. Learned a great deal. We have a few questions, but I'd love to encourage others to submit more via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So one, you might have actually touched on this before, but from Shima Nemoto, who asked, what's the source of the Koji Cellars picture? Any particular picture book or scroll for sake making?
Right, yeah, I'll just zip back to that picture. It's pretty cool. If I may, okay, here's the Sake Cellars picture. It's also the Koji Cellars pictures comes from the same picture scroll, and that's the poetry contests. It should be contests there, not contexts. Contests by various artisans. So the Japanese title is Shichiju Ichiban Shokunin Uta Awase. It's a picture scroll from about 1500, and it shows 142 shokunin selling different kind of wares in a perhaps in your marketplace or perhaps just in isolation. It's a remarkable text because it tells us right off the bat that, for example, that women could be shokunin. In the early modern period, only men were artisans. But back in the medieval period, women and men equally were artisans. So that's an important thing to recognize, because I think shokunin to some extent has become a buzzword, and often it's associated today with male artisanal expertise. But actually, back in the day, back in the medieval period, it was both male and women, men and women who were shokunin. It's a fascinating picture scroll. I think the original is in the Tokyo National Museum. There were many, many copies, though, made of it. And indeed, if you go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art's website, you can see a 18th century copy of it that was a woodblock print copy of it. It's also very good, but I like this one, which has its color detail.
One interesting thing from this illustration is how it is referred to as sake. And as you know, I mean, the word sake has over time morphed into a more generic meaning, in a sense, signifying sort of alcoholic beverage as a whole.
Right.
So back at that point in history was what we know as sake or nihonshu, specifically only called sake, or were there other alcoholic beverages, or was the word sake applied to anything else, or was it just the sakes that you outlined in the sake journal?
Basically, that's it, because there's no beer in the medieval period. Shochu comes in maybe late in the 16th century via the Ryukyu Islands, via Okinawa, but that's basically it. Yeah, I mean, no grape wine. Now there are probably some versions of sake that people are making in the countryside using different types of grains that aren't rice. That's probably happening, but they're probably calling those sake,
Mm-hmm.
So millet, for example, some parts in Gifu prefecture, even up until the modern period, people were making millet sake. But there wasn't a lot up in that part of Gifu, up in Hida, Takayama. There's not a lot of land to grow rice, so you're eating millet, and so naturally you use millet. And as a bit of an experiment at home, I was really convinced as a historian that you can make sake with millet. I didn't have access to millet, but I had good old Kansas sorghum, and I made some sake that was 50% rice and 50% sorghum. It's got a distinct odor to it, let's just say. And I think my wife said it just doesn't smell right. And I think it has kind of a taste of a dirty belly button, but it still works. it's still something, must be like 15% ABV, so
Right.
it gets the job done. But definitely, I think sake is a rice beverage, definitely.
Right. Okay, another question from Junko Usuba, who is our newest member of our board, asks, interesting to learn that sake was brewed by temples. In modern Japan, it seems this is no longer the case. Why are temples no longer the main sake brewers in Japan?
Yeah, I think that has a lot to do with the way the economy and society changed in the transition from the medieval to early modern period. Because back in the medieval period, 1200 to 1600, temples are vast concerns. They have lots of lands. Some of them have their own armies. They can take that land and the rents from that land that are paid in kind, and they can sell those rents and make cash, or they can, like a lot of temples did, turn them into a finished good like sake. That changes in the early modern period. A lot of those temples lost those lands. They certainly lost a lot of autonomy. Early modern period is much more rigid in terms of who can do what. So for example, the way the society was set up, you have 4 status groups: samurai, peasants, artisans, and merchants. And artisans, they're the ones who can create things. Temples, they're not even in that 4-part structure. They're supposed to be outside of that. They're not supposed to engage in these kind of activities. They don't stop brewing right away. Like 1600, and someone just didn't say, "Hey, it's 1600, we got to stop brewing sake." It continues on for a couple more decades, but gradually these temples get phased down. And I think another part of that story is the rise of commercial brewers in the Kansai region, and they just up the scale. They start using barrels, huge barrels, with a much larger capacity than the medieval brewers used. So initially, like 10 koku barrels as opposed to a 1 koku jar, and the temples just can't compete with that. But it's a gradual process. But it gets phased out. And I think also the government, is a little more restrictive of what religious institutions are supposed to be doing in the early modern period. But it's a good question. I mean, why did that go away? It's one that I've put to other scholars and no one else has come up with a good answer. So that you just heard mine.
Great. We have another question. Can you talk about doburoku? Where is its place in history of sake and its return of popularity to current younger generations?
Yeah, I think a lot of what the brewers in the medieval times are making, this cloudy sake, which is kind of all in one step, would be the equivalent of doburoku, right? But they don't call it that. The word doburoku, at least from my understanding, is one that gets used more in the early modern period. And it's to designate sake that's not made. It could be made by a brewery, but it could also be made by a neighborhood guy, guy down the street who's making doburoku. It's a cheaper product in terms of price, in terms of labor, but it's one that's sold. So if you go to a gastropub in the early modern period, you walk in there and you order your sake based upon how much you want to drink and the type. So you might, if you're pinching pennies or pinching, what do they have back then, monme, pinching copper coins, you might order doburoku. You might just say, I'll have ichigo of this doburoku. And that's all well and good. Now, doburoku doesn't really become a problem until the Japanese government in the modern period says it's a problem. It says, you're not allowed to brew at home. And the government said, we're going to consider anything that's cloudy at all to be a doburoku, right? And so that's why there is no nigori sake produced until the 1960s, when some brewers are able to convince the governments and say, hey, we can do this without it being a doburoku. We're going to pay our taxes, and we're going to make a cloudy sake here, because that's the thing that the government didn't like, is people brewing at home and not paying their taxes. Why there's been a resurgence? Because I think, with home brewing in beer, that's probably got people's interested in home brewing at sake, and it's so darn easy. It really is. If I can do it, the hard part is making the koji, right? For me, at least. And the rest is just kind of being patient and being meticulous about it. But I think people who experiment with it discover they can make something that's not bad, at home. So I think maybe young people are willing to do that. But mind you, I guess it's still illegal it is illegal to do this in Japan, and the penalties are pretty stiff. So you are warned. I'm not advocating it if you're in Japan. Don't say that you heard it here. Come to America. Brew your own sake.
Since you're talking about home brewing, Michael Britsky asked, did people brew at home um, back in the day, as you say?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. People brewed back at home. As a matter of fact, in the Kamakura period, which is 12th to the early 14th century, the warrior government got angry with all the home brewing. They said, you know, in Kamakura at least, people were brewing too much at home, and they would limit people to only just one sake pot. So you didn't have much of a commercial brewing scene. So if you wanted to drink sake, you brewed it at home. And even back in the 8th century, Prince Nagaya, who was associated with those wood baggage strips that people try to use to recreate sake today, he was brewing sake at home and he was selling it. So there's a long, long tradition of home brewing in Japan. It's only in the late 19th century that this becomes illegal and you're not supposed to do it anymore.
Want to continue to encourage folks to submit your questions. I have one.
And I had one thing I could have talked about that I didn't talk about that I can mention, Wes.
Sure.
You would, I think in the prompts for this, or the information about this talk, had mentioned that I would talk about kuchikami sake.
Yes, we have to get to that.
Yeah, this is one of those other ones that you may not want to make at home. What comes before all these recipes that I talked about earlier? If I can just skip back to that slide. How do people perhaps make sake before this? Use of in Japan. There's a lot of speculation about this because the sources are very fragmented, but we do have one text from the 8th century that describes people in a village getting together and chewing rice and then spitting it into a container, and then using that saliva basically functions as koji. It helps break down the starches, the enzymes in saliva break down the starches. I think it's amylase in particular, break down the starches, allow them to turn into sugars that can be used for fermentation. So at least according to this 8th century record, some villagers someplace in Japan did this. Now, this is a very strange record, and I could talk about that. But this seems to be a tradition, you know, that it was continued in Japan, even in Okinawa, for instance, up until the 20th century, this chewed sake. There are a couple problems with this. First of all, as the original text shows us, this was something that men and women did, and oftentimes today the way this is discussed is that it was women's sake. Women were the one, or some especially like sacred women were the ones making the sake, and that's not necessarily the case at all. This was something that both men and women did. Another thing is that it must have been pretty difficult to do because, you know, chewing rice like that, raw rice, that's basically why I wouldn't want to try to reproduce this, because, you know, you're going to be doing a lot of chewing. If you imagine like trying to chew raw rice, you might crack a filling. I don't want to risk that at my age. So yeah, that is said to be perhaps a prototype of sake. How widespread that was, we really don't know. Have people try to reproduce it? Yes, but my advice is don't go there.
Right. Yeah, and I hope they were all vaccinated when they were doing this.
No, I read some study, and this is great. I think if it was a professor today, he or she would be, you know, lose their job because they made their students chew like rice for 30 minutes and then spit it. And then he was interested to see if like perhaps the female students had higher types of amylase in their saliva than men, to sort of confirm the hypothesis that women were the ones who did this. He couldn't find that. The only difference he could find is that in the students who brushed their teeth in the morning and those who had not. And I should also say too that this type of chewing as a basis to break down starches for sake making, that's found globally. So lots of alcohol traditions in South America, for example, this is something that's found, but actually all over the world. So it's not just Japan where we find examples of this. It's really global.
So Todd Bellamy asks, how did the sake industry in Japan go from lots of women involved in the 1500s to have women being a rarity in breweries in the modern age?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and that's something I tackle in this forthcoming piece in the Sake Times. But to give you the executive summary, actually to back up a little bit, toji, the word toji that we're all familiar with, meaning brewmaster. If we go back to the 8th century in Japan, that originally meant the female leader of a clan. Yeah, so that, I mean, there were different Japanese characters used, but that's where people think that the word toji comes from, as a female clan leader. And later on, the word changes to mean wife, but back in the 8th century, when it's first used, this is a person with a great deal of authority over this economic and social and political group. So it was originally a female leader. Why did women disappear from the sake industry, from the transition from the medieval to the early modern period? I think that has to do with changes in brewing technology. Because in the early modern period, brewers shift to winter brewing. They give up all those ceramic vessels. They move to these huge wooden barrels. So they're ramping up production that way. Production becomes seasonal. So they want to have seasonal workers. Who's available to hire? But fishermen and farmers who need a job in the wintertime. And then these guys start going to the breweries and they become the manual labor force. I think, medieval brewing was still tough, but it was much more manageable to work with a 45-gallon vessel than a 450-gallon vessel. Just it's a matter of scale. And so the breweries, they started increasing their labor force in the early modern period. It's a seasonal labor force, it's a male labor force. And because of that, women get kind of pushed out of the sake business. And it's not just sake, because women get kind of pushed out of a lot of professions in the early modern period, a much more patriarchal period than the medieval period, or even in the ancient one, it's even more kind of, it's even better for women, ancient Japan. So indeed, in the early modern period, that medieval term shokunin, which meant artisan, came to refer only to men. There were only male shokunin in the early modern period. So it's a much more sexist society overall. And then with all the changes that are happening with technology in the sake industry, we transition into a situation where you have a large male workforce and really no place for women. But my hypothesis is that women were still involved. So if a family owned a brewery, for instance, the woman of the household might be doing the books, she might be in charge of having to deal with the rice broker or something like that. But oftentimes, these folks don't appear in the historical record. But I'm pretty sure that's what happened, because trades, occupations were collective concerns of a household, and men were doing cooking in the early modern period, and women were involved in the trade that the households engaged in. So
fascinating. I'm wondering, since you are a specialist in Japanese food and cuisine and the history of Japanese food, and you've done all this phenomenal research on sake, is there have you come across anything that remotely resembles the kind of pairing suggestions, or anything that would indicate how sake could be paired with food?
That's the frustrating thing, because sake was served with food. As a matter of fact, in the medieval period, the word for menu literally means the food that you have with sake. The Japanese word kondate. A kon was a serving of sake, and date is kind of what you have with it. And people talk about what you have with the sake, but as for the type of sake that you're supposed to serve, is it an aged sake? Is it a cloudy sake? This never gets mentioned except like in very specific ritual contexts, such as the emperor's enthronement ritual, where you need to have the white sake and the black sake. But it's very frustrating. I mean, people don't talk about the taste of the food, you know? And especially in the medieval period, they're very interested in appearance. So at a medieval banquet, you might have several trays of food served to each person individually, and then even have more food that's just purely decorative. And the chefs are very concerned about how this all looks, but how this all tastes, you know, they don't write that so much, and unfortunately, they don't talk about how the sake tastes. They talk about drunkenness a lot, you know. You have all these wonderful records about aristocrats going to a banquet, and oh yeah, I got so drunk, I threw up on this byobu, this screen painting. You know, I feel bad about it, and they would drink so much, and then you know whoever got sick first had to have a party, had to host everybody the next day. You know, it's just so they drank a lot of sake, but they're not so much interested in being sommelier about sake,
Right.
and appreciating it for its taste qualities. But maybe, just maybe, it didn't taste very good compared to what we can enjoy today. Although they did have favorite brands. They did have favorite brands. Yeah. So there was a brewery in medieval Kyoto, the Willow Brewery, which is very famous, to the point that people would make not black market, but they would say it was Willow sake, but it wasn't really sake from that brewery. You know, they would make knockoff versions of it. You know, and maybe that's what the author of Sake Journal was doing. Maybe that's what it was. She was making knockoff versions of temple sake and the other types of sake as a way to make something that would be appealing to their customers.
Right. We are coming across 1 hour. So I guess there's time for one more question. I haven't seen any other new ones coming in. Someone, Ken Fornatero asks, did a yeast guild ever develop? And you mentioned the Koji guilds, but how about yeast?
No, I don't think people, how much they understood about what yeast did is a real question I'm trying to figure out. Because later, like in the 19th century, certainly yeasts get isolated, you know, that's a very famous story. And then the Japanese government does that and then makes these yeasts available to brewers. But before then, I mean, it's all like sourdough, right? We have to rely upon ambient yeasts. And I think that's what medieval brewers did. So the notion of trying to like market them, that they would never have thought of that. But koji, I mean, you need that for so many things. And that must have been a very lucrative guild because you're selling to hundreds of breweries, you're selling to the home brewer, you're selling to the miso maker. They use koji in sushi in the medieval period. So it's a really great market if you could corner the koji market. Those people did pretty well. No wonder they got into trouble and fights with people, to the point that they burned down Kitano Shrine in one instance. Yeah.
Right. No, it's interesting from your article. I read that that these recipes don't start with the koji component, right? I mean, the assumption is that you already have it. It's already been, you know, propagated on the rice.
You bought it. Yeah, you bought it. You bought it ready to go.
Interesting.
And that's what I think, you know, the seller was selling there is not the koji kin. Maybe I misspoke earlier. Not the powdered koji, but the actual like koji that's inoculating rice. I mean, it's hard to tell from these pictures, but that's my guess. That's my guess. Is that it's all ready to go, you know.
Right.
The bucket in the foreground is that's from a different artisan. I think that's a salt cellar. So that's not koji. It's those two trays that she has, different color, moldy stuff.
Right. Are there any other questions as we wrap up here? If not, then I would like to thank once again Professor Rath for this really, really fascinating discussion. Again, I learned a lot. I'm sure a lot of our viewers did too. This is just fantastic. I can't wait to see your book on the history of sake coming out. When is that? When is expected publication?
Well, I'm on sabbatical right now. I got to write it first. So that's the goal, hopefully for this year. Maybe it's overly ambitious, but I'm trying my best and really enjoying it. And in the meantime, a couple of my things are coming out in the Sake Times and other places. So.
Excellent. We'll look for that. And, the invitation is open for you to come back and join us again. And I'm sure just thrilled to learn even more from you about your research into sake and its history. So thank you again, and thank all our viewers for joining us tonight. Keep posted about our future webinars that we'll announce on our website and our social media platforms. Again, our website is www.sakeassociation.org. So with that, I want to thank you all. Thank you again, Professor Rath. And
thank you.
Yeah, thank you all. Good evening.